I feel that Plato had a very specific audience in mind, and also a very specific purpose for what he was communicating. So I think he took the essence of truth from the story that was passed down to him from Solon, and he developed a more full story around it. And the key points that I'm going to take from Plato's story are that there was a civilization before the flood, and it was suddenly destroyed in some kind of cataclysm. And I do think that some of his description points are valid. And I do also think that the cultural deterioration was also highly significant, not just a part of his political narrative. Plato apparently wrote up the findings of his ancestor Solon's discussion with a priest in Egypt. Solon's time in Egypt was verified by Plutarch, who actually wrote about Solon's life. So we don't doubt that Solon did spend time in Egypt. And we know that Plato was in fact related to Solon. According to Plato, the priest had translated the story of Atlantis for Solon as it was written on the walls of a temple in Sais, on the temple of Neith. So it's safe to say that we're not getting the story direct, and we don't in fact know how many hands it even passed through before it was written on the walls of the temple in Egypt. It should not therefore have surprised me that the story given by Plato differs so greatly from my dream regressions. And yet the differences are so great that I was initially extremely disappointed and rather dismayed to have read it. My thoughts ran rampant along the lines of, maybe my dream regressions are not of Atlantis after all, since I never actually heard the name Atlantis used. Or maybe I am crazy and it's all just my imagination. Or maybe, how could I have got it all so wrong, unless it was only my imagination the whole time? Then I calmed down a bit, and I got to thinking, well, how did the Egyptians get this story? How many times had it been retold before it was carved into the wall of the temple at Sais? Was this the exact story that Solon had documented? Or did Plato embellish the story to make it more interesting or more valuable as an educational tool? Was there more than one story of war with Athens? And maybe the two stories had become intertwined. So many thoughts, but one thing I realized. The story of Plato has been passed through many hands, but the version that I give to you has passed through only my hands. I may not be able to remember everything perfectly. I've certainly tried to document things and make sure I capture as much as I can immediately after I've had one of these dream regressions. But occasionally I have missed bits and things, so I don't expect my record is absolutely perfect. Not only that, but I don't actually have any way of measuring things like, the distance between the land and the water. I mean, I can give it a fairly good guess, but I don't have any somnambulant tape measures with me so that I can measure those areas. Sometimes, though, I do worry that my waking world might infiltrate my dreams. For example, I do see things in the dreams that look like iPads, black iPads, but I've looked back in my journals and I did see things that looked like iPads long before iPads came a thing. So I'm torn. It's just hard to know. But I believe in my dreams, and overall, I think that my account of Atlantis is probably more believable for several reasons. Firstly, why would a culture of such great antiquity have so many similarities to the culture of Greece at that time? Secondly, Plato himself confessed that names in the story were first converted into Greek from Egyptian, and the Egyptians themselves must have converted it from whatever the previous language was. So I think it got quite heavily adjusted along the way. Thirdly, the place called Tantal in my dream regressions is a place very, very different to our world today, and also to the world of the Greeks. And it makes much more sense to me that it is different. Why would it be similar? And fourthly, the gods and the myths. It felt like Plato had to include the belief in the gods, because it would have been totally unacceptable to speak of a great nation of atheists. But Tantal, for the majority of its existence, was in fact a great nation of atheists. Admittedly, they believed in reincarnation, but they didn't believe in any deities. Well, not until Japet came along, and he decided that he himself was a god. And then they had no choice but to believe in a deity, but hey, it wasn't a real deity anyway. If the story originated in Egypt, then who was Poseidon in the Egyptian realm? Because I can't see any equivalent god from Egypt. And if the story was transferred between Egypt and Greece, then surely there would be an equivalent. The names, I don't have anything in my collection of memories of anything like Poseidon, but it says in the Encyclopedia Britannica that Poseidon was in fact the son of Cronus. Now here's a name that rings a bell. So we've got Bela of Kron in Tantal, and it's quite possible that there were children of Bela of Kron, but of course by that stage I had left Tantal. So that's why I would like to take out anything that talks about myth or gods, those sorts of things that you would expect the Greeks to have in their mythology. And yet there are some parallels between Plato's story and my dream regressions. Firstly, the reference to Neith. That is a giant validation for both stories, that there is a kernel of truth, especially in Plato's story. And it does create that link between Plato's Atlantis and my Tantal. In addition, Neith was a place and a person, and that's consistent with my regressions. But Plato's description of Neith being the person, being a lover of war and wisdom, is a far cry from the Neith that I knew. Yes, she did love wisdom, but her greatest love was agriculture. So in that we differ. She was a strong, don't mess with me kind of woman, with a heart as generous as is possible for any person to have. The combination of differences in Plato's story, as well as the similarities in Plato's story, has me rather confused. But rather than just cherry pick the things that I see that substantiate my regressions and ignore the rest, I will try to instead work out why the disparity is so great, and when I find a reason for that disparity, like the way the Greeks would have had to include their gods, and the way they also develop their mythical stories. Now, these elements of the story of Atlantis, I think I can eliminate from my comparison, because it's very obvious where they came from. So what do I think happened? I think that at some point, 2 or more stories got combined into one, and maybe the stories got embellished along the way. So what was the other story? If I look at who else went to war with Athens before the time of Plato, I find that the Carthage-Athenian War was relatively current for 80 BC, and that there were a lot of similarities with Carthage in the story. I wonder if some of the descriptions of Atlantis was actually inspired by Carthage. I'm pretty sure that Carthage would have been considered a worthy and even admirable opponent, either because the description of Atlantis given by the Egyptians was beyond the comprehension of the Greeks, or maybe they didn't like the description of a peaceful people with a crazy leader, Japet. That may have seemed contrary to how they viewed great civilizations. Or maybe they just didn't like that the story hadn't got enough detail and lacked sufficient about things like war, that they decided, well, they must have been a certain way, so they just added that. Here, of course, I'm guessing. Solon was around from 360 BC till about 560 BC, so the Carthage angle couldn't have been his work. But Plato was around from the mid-420s through to the mid-340s BC, so Plato would have known all about Carthage. And his thought process may have been that since Carthage was such a great civilization, it must have been similar to Atlantis. He may also have been influenced by the loss of the Minoan civilization, since it was in fact destroyed virtually overnight. But Carthage, it seems to be the strongest point of influence on this story. On the description of Carthage got from Wikipedia. The following describes Carthage. Quote, 2 large artificial harbours were built within the city, one for harbouring the city's massive navy of 220 warships, and the other for mercantile trade. A walled tower overlooked both harbours. Surrounding Carthage were walls of great strength, said in places to rise above 13 metres, being nearly 10 metres thick according to the ancient authors. To the west, 3 parallel walls were built. The walls altogether ran for about 33 kilometres, so that's 21 miles, to encircle the city. Between the sea-filled Kothon, an artificial protected inner harbour, and the Bursa Heights, a citadel, lay the Agora, the city-state's central marketplace for business and commerce. The Agora was also an area of public squares and plazas where the people might formally assemble or gather for festivals. Visitors to the several growing regions that surrounded the city wrote admiringly of the lush green gardens, orchards, fields, irrigation channels, hedgerows, as well as the many prosperous farming towns located across the rural landscape. So this is the description of Carthage that we get from Wikipedia. So if I remove all the parts of the story from Plato that sound like the city of Carthage and its warring nature with its worship of gods, etc., and also remove the aspects that might be Minoan or sound particularly mythical, what is left of Plato's story is a fairly close match to my memories of Tantal. I think I should also replace the word island with just land and sea with just water. And because Tantal didn't initially have any ships, they had submersibles, I'm going to replace the word ship or boat with vessel. So if I remove all those components, as I discussed, this is what remains of Plato's story. Looking towards the water from the centre, there was a plain, which is said to have been the fairest of all plains, and very fertile. Near the plain, in the centre of the land, at a distance of about 50 stadia, there was a mountain, not a very high one, on any side. Alternative zones of sea and land, larger and smaller, encircled one another. There were 2 of land and 3 of water, equidistant in every way. Fountains, both of cold and hot, sprang from under the earth and were used as baths. Every variety of food was available, also fragrant things, roots, herbs, wood, flowers, fruits, both the dry edible fruit, nuts, chestnuts, legumes, and the fruits were hard rind, plus there were plants for ointments, and all this owing to the excellence of the soil. There was great wealth, and the people were provided with everything they required, both in city and country. They were able to mine minerals and metal in their land, including orichalcum. They had sufficient resources for tame and wild animals, and there were many elephants. There were temples, palaces, harbours, and docks. I've kept this in, by the way, because even though there weren't temples and palaces when I was there were temples and palaces at the time of Japan. Anyway, back to the description. There were bridges over the zones of water, which surrounded the ancient metropolis, and there were passages into and out of the zones. There was a place for the habitation of their ancestors. By this, I assume that they mean a place where they can remember those who have died. And from the sea, they dug a canal. There was a way underneath for the vessels, for the banks of the zones were raised considerably above the water. The main island, the zones, and the bridge were surrounded by a stone wall on either side, placing towers and gates on the bridges where the sea passes in. Although that part does sound a bit like Carthage, it is also a good description of Tantal. So I think that by leaving that in, it makes it obvious how the similarities between Tantal and Carthage could have motivated Plato to actually use more of the description of Carthage than was necessary. The stone which was used was white, and another black, and a third red. And as they quarried, they at the same time hollowed out their docks. The docks therefore had roofs formed out of the native rock. Some of their buildings were simple, but in others they put together different stones which they intermingled for the sake of ornament, to be a natural source of delight. The entire circuit of the wall, which went round the outermost one, they covered with a coating of brass, and the circuit of the next wall they coated with tin, and the third, which they encompassed the citadel, flashed with the red light of orichalcum. Atlantis did have temples towards the end, but I just didn't see them, so I really can't say what they were like. But I can comment on the next parts. There were statues of gold of such a size that they touched the roof of the building. There were aqueducts which passed over the bridges to the outer circles. In the centre of one of the larger islands, there was a race course, and it was allowed to extend all around the island. Of course, in Tantal it wasn't for horses, it was for ostriches. Anyway, crossing the outer harbours, which were 3 in number, you'd come to a wall which began at the sea and went all around. This was everywhere. The whole country was described as being very lofty and precipitous on the side of the sea. But the country immediately about and surrounding the city was a level plain, itself surrounded by mountains which descended towards the sea. It was smooth and even, but being of an oblong shape and extending in one direction and going up the country from the sea through the centre of the island, the whole region of the land lies towards the south and is sheltered from the north. The surrounding mountains were celebrated for their number and size and beauty, and there were wealthy inhabitants that lived in the villages in the mountains. There were rivers and lakes and meadows. The plain was rectangular and for the most part straight and oblong, and what it wanted of the straight line followed the line of the circular ditch. It was carried round the whole of the plain. It received the streams which came down from the mountains and winding around the plain and touched the city at various points, where it then let off into the sea. The main area, plus the 9 other areas, were for the different governments. So that meant 10 kings. Now, we didn't have 10 kings, but we did have 10 locations. Poseidon's law was inscribed on a column of orichalcum, which was situated in the middle of the island. Now here, I don't know about what was used to hold Jappe's laws, so maybe it was a column of orichalcum. But when it came to Uran and Bela, they both had a large obelisk with their laws inscribed on them. And yes, it was in the middle of the center island. There were bulls, yes, there certainly were, but there were also cows and ostriches. As long as the divine nature lasted in them, they were obedient to the laws. They practiced gentleness and wisdom in the various chances of life and in their intercourse with one another. They despised everything but virtue, not caring for their present state of life and thinking lightly on their possessions of gold and other property, which seemed only a burden to them. Neither were they intoxicated by luxury, nor did wealth deprive them of their self-control. But they were sober, and they saw clearly that all these goods are increased by the virtuous friendship with one another. Plato goes on to say that if they had had excessive zeal for, I assume, things like material items, the good of those things, well, it would be lost, and the friendship would perish that they had. All that which was described, according to Plato, waxed, and human nature got the upper hand, and they were unable to bear their own fortune. And to those who had an eye to see, they began to appear base, and had lost the fairest of their precious gifts. But for those who had no eye to see what was true happiness, they still appeared glorious and blessed at the very time when they were filled with unrighteous avarice and power. Wow, this last bit that Plato describes is absolutely what I understand happened when Japan took over and things started to really go downhill. Plato spoke of a war between Atlantis and Athens, and yes, there was such a war. According to Plato, it was before the destruction of Atlantis, which he claimed was 9,600 BC. My estimate for the destruction of Atlantis was 10,400 BC. So that's a difference of 800 years. Not really so massive in the scheme of things, but hey. So my timeline for the war between Atlantis and Athens was 11,570 BC. But Plato just said that it was before the deluge. So I guess that works for me. In the time frame of Plato, Athens was founded by Neith, also before the deluge. My time frame for the start of Neith was, about 34,600 BC. It's not clear how long before the flood Plato suggests, or the Egyptians suggests, that it was founded. But, it's possibly a difference, not sure. Atlantis under Japan, as I said, did go to war and conquered the regions described by Plato. In fact, it was slightly more complex than described by Plato. But when Atlantis was lost, it was not sank. It's more accurate to say that it was swept away by water. The location in my regressions for Atlantis was on a continent, not on an island. But there were islands within Atlantis. So I can't reconcile this difference between Plato's story and mine. The story of Poseidon and his activities I've left out because they reek of myth. And the names of the 10 sons, the 5 pairs of twins, also reeks of some kind of mythical significance that we no longer understand today. I cannot make comparison because I've got nothing to compare with the myths. Japan, as the last ruler, did have many children, both male and female, but I do not know if there were 5 sets of male twins or if this is even relevant. In Plato's version of Atlantis, there were 10 locations for the 10 kings. I don't know if that could have been misunderstood, but in Tantal there were also 10 locations, but not for 10 kings, but for 12 universities. Plato says that Atlantis was created by Poseidon using his godly powers, but in my regression it was just built by Uran, the first leader, with his awesome technology. The city part of Atlantis is described as having concentric circles, an island within an island separated by water. This is accurate to my regressions and is the main reason that I believe Tantal to be Atlantis. But I can't actually tell the exact measurements by just looking at it. I can only give a rough guess. The image of Carthage that we looked at earlier also has an island within an island, and may be the reason for the amalgamation of the two descriptions. Or Plato may have assumed that Carthage was based on Atlantis, and hence would have more similarities. Taking Plato literally, we would have to conclude that Atlantis was an island in the Atlantic. And of course this does not match to my regressions. I can only assume from what I have seen in my regressions that Atlantis was in Africa, but I cannot find any location to match the identifying features within my regressions, except maybe the Regression structure. But the lack of any lakes and rivers makes it look so different. But it's fairly safe to assume that the world did look different 12 to 36,000 years ago. It was the waterways that made the areas easy to identify in my regressions, and without them I'm struggling to identify locations. Well, Plato said Atlantis had a wide, fertile plain, growing lots of things and with elephants nearby. So comparing that to Tantal, I can give it a nice big tick, because Tantal certainly had a wide, fertile plain. It grew heaps of stuff, and nearby there were definitely elephants. Next thing, the central island had a raised hill with hot and cold springs. Once again, big tick. That's exactly how it was with Tantal. Plato said that there were mountains to the northwest. I will give this a tick, but they're really more of tallish hills. I guess some people might call them mountains, but I wouldn't really call them mountains. There were mountains around, but they were quite a long way up towards the north. The ones that were nearby, I prefer to call them hills, but I guess it's everybody's different perspective. Then another point made by Plato were the 3 colours of rock and the several types of metals. This, once again, it gets a tick. The substance they call, what the Plato calls orichalcum, I just know it as being a gold and copper alloy. I don't think it was anything particularly special. It could be mined naturally where gold and copper were in the same area, and it really did have a lovely colour. I personally love having the gold jewellery that has the copper in it, because it just gives me that feeling of home. Yeah, it's a weird kind of feeling, I don't know. Anyway, the story from Plato says that only the males were in positions of authority, and it all revolved around 5 pairs of male children. But in my regressions of Tantal, there was nothing like that. Well, maybe after the reign, once Japet took over, because towards the end of his reign, there was a certain negativity towards females. But most of the time in Tantal, there was virtually no difference between males and females. And nobody even thought that there should be. It never entered anyone's head that male or female was better or worse than the other. Admittedly, we knew that there were differences, but that had no significance to us. And a lot of people actually chose to be relatively androgynous. It's my understanding also, while perusing some of Plato's other material, that he wasn't particularly a fan of democracy, but he rather preferred that a leader was a philosopher or thinker who was benevolent to the people and really cared and did what was best for them. So in terms of Tantal, I think with a few exceptions, Plato probably would have approved of the way Tantal was run, at least at the start of the of Uran's rule, and also most of Bela's rule. I would like to point out at this stage that I never saw a pyramid, a real pyramid, in Tantal. What I did see were obelisks with a pyramid top and a small pyramid base, but I never saw any large, real pyramids in Tantal. I saw them in Kem, and I saw them in other places, but because I never saw them in Tantal, this is a point I should make, because Plato never said that there were pyramids in Atlantis. And I'm sure that if there had been pyramids in Atlantis, since the Egyptians had all these amazing measurements of how wide the land was and how big everything was, they would surely have made a point to mention that there were pyramids in Atlantis. Anyway, so that to me is another good match for Tantal being Atlantis. In terms of the sections of Plato's dialogues where he gives actual measurements, that's pretty impressive that there are real measurements in there. So the centralmost island of Tantal is roughly the size of an island in New Zealand that I'm very familiar with. And it's a nice circular island. It's called Rangitoto. So, as I said, the island that I refer to is circular, and it's a very good approximation to the central island of Tantal. And that's quite a lot larger than Plato's version. But I have no idea how to translate a stade. When I did a search on how big is a stade, there's like stades for Egyptian stade, the Greek stade, it's really, really confusing. So I have no idea really how big Plato's version was. But just looking at it roughly from the Greek stade, it does look as if the version from Plato looks a bit on the small side. And when you look at any artistic representations of Atlantis, they look so tiny. It looked like a really small place. Not anything size-wise that compared to what I'm used to in my dream regressions. Anyway, so the outermost island, I must point out, in my regressions was not perfectly circular, but the middle island and the inner island were both absolutely perfectly circular and equidistant. So none of these islands were totally flat. The central island was raised up, and the middle island had some flat bits and some raised, like hilly bits, just gentle hills, And the third island was mainly flattish, but it did have hilly bits as well. It also had a complete beach. The whole area at the third ring, the outer aspect of it, was just a gentle slope to a beach. You see, it was easy to find Kim, and easier even to find Neath, because, they'd been through changes, but they still looked essentially similar to the way they did in my dream regressions. But finding Tantal, that's another thing altogether. Without these rivers and lakes as landmarks, it's really, really difficult. So the nearest river was about 10 kilometers away, but the ocean was a lot further. At a guess, I would say the distance from Tantal to the ocean was about the same as the distance between Auckland in New Zealand, which is where I live, and a place called Palmerston North, also in New Zealand, and that's where I used to work. So it's rough, but it's the best I can do, because as I said, I don't have any way of measuring. I can also remember a very large waterfall nearby, probably within 50 k's. In my dream regressions, there were hills surrounding mainly the northern aspect and the western aspect. But these were real hills. They weren't mountains as such. There were mountains, decent-sized mountains to the north, but they were a way off. And so that's a bit of a difference to what Plato had to say. The whole concept of the inner circle and the various rings, the canals that Plato mentioned, they all ring true, to my version of things from my regressions. And I just can't comment on the planes. The planes. So I've been through all my dream journals, and I've done a compilation
of all the things that I wrote down that could help with determining a location. So the first one was regarding canals. It's pretty much what Plato said. So let's talk about some of the specifics from my dream regressions. For example, all ships operated on and under the water. I do not remember seeing any boats that just floated, except for ones owned by the primitives, but not by us. And so all the ships were essentially submersibles. And that's quite a big subject, which I should probably do a whole episode on, because submersibles are actually quite interesting. So it's because of these submersibles that the canals were so big. But it's also very important to talk about the canals. Now, in Plato's version, the canal went from Atlantis all the way out to the sea, I think. Yep. But that's not how it worked for Tantal. The main canal went out to a river, which was about 10 kilometers away. And from there, it was possible to get to the ocean. However, there was a difference in the altitude. So Tantal was not at sea level. So that meant that heading down from the level that Tantal was on, through the river and down to the ocean, was not possible without the technology that we had put in place, which was a lock. So I will come back to that, because the locks we used were for many reasons. If we just had a regular canal that had utilized the full length, then for one thing, during the dry months, the river would be low and unnavigable. And two, the ability to return upstream, well, even when the river was high, that would still have been challenging, because there were waterfalls and they were beautiful, but they were not conducive to going up and down a river. And anyone in a regular boat might have been able to get down during the wet season, if they took their lives in their hands over the waterfalls, but they certainly wouldn't have been able to get back, neither in the wet season or the dry season. So the locks were vital. And one of those locks, I know this is going to sound ridiculous, but it was underground, an underground lock. But without the locks, the water from Tantal would simply have drained out through the canal into the river, and in the dry season, the canals of Tantal would all have been empty. So a lock was preferred to a dam, because a lock was a lot less damaging than a dam. Anyway, as I said before, there are a lot of lakes around and a lot of rivers. The main river was down towards the south, and the sea was off to the west. So the main canal that left Tantal went southwest. There was one major lock before it joined up with the river, and the river headed westwards. So part of the canal, as I mentioned, went underground, and at one end of one of these locks, it came out at the very deep part of the river where the largest of the waterfalls was located. The reason is because in order to be able to go and return freely, that kind of lock was required. And I use the word lock carefully because I don't have any better word to describe. I don't think that there are such things as underground locks in our world, but they fill such a similar role to what we call locks that that's what I'm calling them. I only remember one underground lock, but I'm not sure if there was only one. But anyway, it came out at the deepest part of the river where the really beautiful big waterfall was located. And the reason was that in order to be able to go and return freely, then without the underground lock, the change in elevation was too much, and it meant that it would have been very difficult for the submersibles to get past the great, beautiful waterfall. And since all the ships were submersible, a single, really decent-sized lock made it much more feasible. When we first moved to Tantal, everyone lived on the central island, as I mentioned, and that continued for thousands of years because the central island was a decent size. The two outer islands at that time were used for produce and security. Now, talking about security and even growing things, the central and middle island rings both of them had high walled areas from the canal, from the water, and it went all around, full distance around. There was not an entrance from the water. You either had to access it by flight or by being in one of the submersibles and going underwater to get inside. The last island, the outer island, had a wall in the innermost side, but the outer side was just a beach, as I said, a beautiful beach, and it went the full length, surrounded the whole of the outer ring. From the beach there was a gentle slope, as a general rule, that went upwards, a very gentle kind of gradient. The outer ring in particular had many, many beautiful trees, really beautiful, big, well-established trees, and a lot of areas that looked grassy, but I don't think they weren't like grass that we have today, but they looked kind of nice and easy to walk on kind of areas. As I said, without a flying device or a submersible, the islands pretty much couldn't be accessed even from each other. If you had a boat and you'd made it as far as the first ring, you could get up on to the outer island via the beach, but from there was absolutely no way to get from there across to the middle or inner islands. The submersibles, however, had tunnels underwater for moving between the islands, and obviously the submersibles and the flying machines were what was used to travel between the islands and in fact to travel outside of Tantal. The submersibles would access the oceans by the canals, which I guess is obvious from what I was describing earlier, and of course the locks were used to safely navigate the change in elevation, both leaving and returning. The simplicity and the excellent functional use of the place under Uran, it was efficient and yet it was very elegant. But after the massive population growth and the pressures on all the resources, the place kind of lost its simplicity. It didn't necessarily lose its beauty, but things became a lot more complicated. I understand from others, not from seeing with my own eyes in Migrations, but I understand that the Central Island did get a lot of attention from Japan when he took over. He was into things being very ornate And so he was really into making the buildings very ornate. Of course, he added a lot of temples and statues of himself, and added lots more gold and silver and the red gold. He also had a really big palace built for himself on the central island. There were 3 travel towers on each ring. I'm not sure if Japan added to that or not. When I first went to Tantal, there was only the 1 tower, but the other 2 were soon added. But I can't remember exactly what the time frames were on the building of the towers. But hey, that was all within the reign of Uran. So I think that pretty much covers most of the things that I can remember from my dream regressions. So in summary, Plato's version, although conceptually is a good match, it's a lot smaller than I remember in my regressions. But then again, I don't know how much the measurements have translated and distorted, and I don't know also if I'm getting the right conversion for the states. And I also mentioned about the fertile plains. They sound like they were during the era of Japan, when more land mass was required for the population growth. As indicated by the heading of this episode, where the bleep is Atlantis or Tantal? Oh, well, I'm not that sure. As I said, the Richat structure is the closest fit, but it's not a perfect fit. There could be good reasons why. By that I mean, at this point in time, I can't say that they're a good match, even though at this point in time it's also the closest match that I can find. So I'll just look at this list and explain it. So the first was, I cannot see on Google Maps or anywhere a hill which is towards the ocean side on the left. I can see the hills above it, which is what was in my regressions, but I can't see any hills towards the left. Unless I'm looking at it wrong, it's missing the hills that are towards the ocean side. The second point is the overall size. The recast structure is still a bit bigger than my estimates. It's not a major difference, and I do admit that my estimates are very rough, so that might not really be a big point. The third point is the lack of waterways, and I know that if I could see a map of what waterways were like 30,000 years ago, I'd be able to say, yes, it's it, or no, it isn't. But I don't have any way of getting a map of waterways from that era. So there are no landmarks for me to measure against. And without them, that makes it just so difficult. My fourth point is the waterfall. Now, this is quite a big landmark. And I've searched where I think where a waterfall might have been if the Richat structure was the one, and I can't see anywhere that might have been a decent sized waterfall or the remains of a waterfall or anything like that nearby. It's not that easy to see waterfalls on maps anyway, unless they're booming and you see all the white froth coming off them. I did actually find an area that looked like it could have been a waterfall, but it wasn't in the position, not in the exact position that I remember. So it was a bit further north than I was expecting it. But I'll put a picture of it up. Anyway, point number 5. Now this is this is one that can make or break the Richard structure for me, because after the Great Deluge, I was part of a team sent to rescue people that were trapped underground in, well, what we would call bunkers. Anyway, the whole place was covered in mud and water and stuff like that, and so we had to actually build very quickly, I might add, an area, a square area with large blocks, an area which we could then pump all the water and the mud out of, and then we could get access to doing a rescue of these people, which we did, by the way. We managed to do that very successfully, and that was another thing that I should really do a whole episode on, because there's a heap that I can tell you about that rescue. But the most important part from the perspective of, is this Atlantis, is if we can find on the Richard structure an area where there are some very large blocks. They wouldn't have been destroyed in the deluge because we put them there after the deluge, and it is a square, and we cut sandstone, very, very large blocks of sandstone, and made about a 10 meter by 10 meter construction. There were no doorway accesses or anything because we wanted to make it so that we could pump out the water and the mud. So that structure, there is absolutely no reason why that structure would not still be there unless someone else came along at another date and removed it. And unless they were willing to cut it up or damage it, then I would say it should still be there in some form. Even if it's covered in a bit of sand and stuff, it should still be there. And that would be not only the evidence that this was in fact Tantal and Atlantis, it would also be an indication of where the access was through to the tunnels and the underground structure. So that would be something pretty major. If we could find that, it would be a big bonus. On the blocks, they were about 2, maybe 3 meters high, so they weren't insignificant. They should stand out. So, getting back to the whole point of this, Plato's story. Yes, I think it's a good enough match to say that Plato was describing the same place as my dream regressions. Yep, there's differences, but I mean, after all that time, one should expect there to be differences.